So tonight I will be teaching. I'm Peggy Hall, and I'm the Agricultural Law Field Specialist for OSU Extension. And I'll be teaching along with Emily Marison, who is Family and Consumer Sciences Educator. She's located over on the eastern side of the state in Coshocton County. And perhaps the newest member of our group, but she's been with us now for a little bit of time, is Nicole Arnold. She's our food safety field specialist, and we are glad to have her joining us as we engage more and more in the needs of our food businesses across the state of Ohio. Also in the background, we have Garth Ruff. He's a member of our team, and he'll be teaching for the next webinar because he is our beef cattle specialist here for OSU Extension. So you know a little bit about us. We'd like to find out more about who's attending this webinar this evening. So we have a couple of poll questions that we'd like you to ask so that we can better understand what kinds of food products you're interested in, how far along you are in your food business process, and what kind of location your food business is in. So Emily is going to put up those polls. If you would please take just a moment and try to answer that and let us know what you're doing. The first one is going on now, asking what type of food you are selling or hope to sell in the future. And thank you. We're getting a lot of participation on that. I see quite a bit going there. All right. And it looks like most of you are. There we go. We have our interpreter now. I think we were having some issues. So sorry, but thank you, Anna, for joining us. It looks like the majority of you are interested in meats and poultry. And then we also have quite a few who are considering baked goods, a few cheesecake and refrigerated dessert makers out there, along with a good number of those who would be doing jams and jellies, those kinds of products, a few candy makers, and some of you who want to make those foods that Nicole will be talking about, salsas and sauces and pickles and those kinds of acidified or canned foods. All right, we have another question coming up, and that is asking, let's see where that one is, Emily. The second one is asking how far along you are in the food business process. So what is your interest? Are you already there, or are you planning to start one? Just thinking about it? Are you someone who is hoping to advise food businesses, or are you just not sure whether you even want to do this? So we'll take a minute and let you answer that poll question. Very good. Looks like we're getting there. Most of you have responded, and it seems to be that many of you are still in the planning phase. So we're glad that you're here and that we can provide these resources that may help you as you continue on in that process. So the majority of you are there, but it looks like we have a good number who are already engaged in a food business, and then some who are just wanting to learn, advise others, or are unsure. Okay, and our third and final poll regards your location. So we're just interested in knowing where you are and where your food business might be, whether you're in a city, a town, or a village, whether you're on a farm, or if you're out in a rural area, but not on a farm. Now, that helps us understand who we're talking to, but sometimes it can matter with different laws or requirements, not so much for the topics we'll be talking about tonight. In last month's webinar, I discussed zoning and how that could be an issue. and this certainly would play into that. But this question is more for our curiosity to understand just where everyone is who is joining us this evening. And it looks like most of you are on a farm, yes. And then a number of you either within a municipality or in a rural area, but not on a farm. Okay, thank you so much for letting us know who's with us, and hopefully we can tailor much of our education tonight to your needs as we consider that. So moving forward, we're reminding you of the last month and the webinar that we presented in January, where Emily reviewed what we're calling a food business startup checklist. So if you think about those common pieces and parts that you need to be aware of if you're considering starting a food business, those are the topics that we've tried to cover in this webinar series. So last month we focused a lot on food safety, why it's necessary, and why so much of our regulatory compliance is built around food safety issues. A little bit on that this month as well that you'll see. And we'll also be talking a lot more about regulatory compliance tonight for those specific types of food products that you may be interested in making and selling. But we've also touched, as we did last month and will next month, on economic questions and addressing that issue of what you may need to be aware of in order to make money as you sell your food product. And last month too, we touched some on legal risk management, and I offered some thoughts on how to start a food business from the legal perspective and different requirements that are in place there. And part of legal risk management as well is the regulatory compliance that we'll be discussing this evening. So a lot of different components that we hope we can plant in your minds as you go about your food business startup or continuing the business that you already have in place. And a reminder that you can find this information in those recorded webinars if you missed any of that last month or can't attend next month. So tonight we're going to focus on selling those home-produced food products and what you need to consider if that's what your food business will be built around. So we have several topics for you. We'll begin with food product development. Emily will be covering that topic and addressing that important question of how to create a consistent food product and what affects the quality of your food product. And then I'll be covering our cottage food law in Ohio and our home bakery law, and explaining to you what those regulatory requirements are for those types of items. And Nicole will come in with a discussion of canned foods, a really difficult topic sometimes to work through and understand what you can and cannot do in regards to making and selling those types of products that we typically considered canned foods. So that's our plan for this evening. And we will begin then with Emily Marison, who will discuss food product development.
Thank you, Peggy. Okay, it is a pleasure to be back with all of you tonight. Welcome back to those of you that were here a month ago. And for those of you who were not able to join us last month, we welcome you to this. I've been very excited to talk about food product development because in my former life, before I came to Extension, I worked for a food company and got to do this all the time. Loved my job. So I'm really excited to be able to share some of these things with you and help you in as you think about starting or expanding what your food business is. So my first question, this is just for you to think about as you look at these items, what do they have in common? So we've got some fashion, garments, tire, electronics, some household appliances. All of these are products that consumers purchase, right? And maybe we haven't really thought about it before, but they've all gone through some kind of a development process, all the way from the idea phase to developing prototypes that were probably tested with consumers to see whether they liked them or not and would purchase them. And then eventually it led to a launch of that product. So even in the food world, we can use this similar type of approach. So we're going to talk through what are the things to consider as we're developing a food product. And this is a look at the process that we'll talk about here this evening. So we'll start with ideation. This is the fun part. This is where we get to dream a little bit. You may be coming into this with your idea already. You know what it is that you want to make, you're just not sure exactly how to get there. Or you may come in with a need that you want to meet, or kind of an area that you're hoping to get into, but you're not exactly sure how to do that yet. So we'll talk about that in ideation. And then the first recipes. We'll talk about testing, maybe not testing from the aspect that we might typically think about. This is not like laboratory testing, but what can we do in our own home kitchen when it comes to thinking about the quality of our food? What kinds of things can we be thinking about? Then we'll share just a little bit about scaling up, because as you get a little bigger and you need to make more and more things, what kinds of questions do you need to consider? And then finally, we'll touch on the launch, because that is where you hope to be, is to be able to sell a product to the consumers. When it comes to this, you may be thinking, I'm not really a process person. Like, I just want to go in, I like cooking, I like baking. I don't really think about all of these kinds of steps necessarily. So why bother with a process? Well, in the long run, it should save you time and money to consider some different factors along the way. It'll help you with your plan. And also, we want to make sure that we have products that are safe, but also that people like to eat. So Peggy mentioned earlier about having a consistent product. We'll talk about how along this whole product development timeline, we're thinking about how we can be consistent in what our recipe is, and how reproducible we can be with our product. The fun begins with ideation. So with the idea. And like I said, I'm guessing that many of you have come to this because along the way, someone has said, you make the best chocolate chip cookies, or you make the best caramel popcorn, whatever it may be. You have that idea already. You've got your recipe out already. Or maybe it's something that has been passed down from generation to generation, and you've been making it for your family, but you're ready to take that next step and try to sell it to other people. It's also, though, possible to come to this without having a recipe yet. And maybe you see some kind of unmet need that's either in your community, or you've been down the grocery aisle before and you've seen some things and thought, I think I could try to make something like that. This is going to be my first disclaimer of the night. So we're dreaming here, and I can already feel my legal friends and my food safety friends getting a little bit anxious about dreaming too much in this part. So just know that, yes, we're going to talk during the next hour and a half about what kinds of things are legal to make in your kitchen, and also what kind of products may just not be feasible to make from a food safety standpoint when we're talking about a packaged good. Like, it may be something that we could make and eat immediately, but if we're going to try to extend the shelf life of it, there might be a lot of considerations we have to take in from a food safety standpoint. So they may come along and squash your dreams later, but right now we're just going to keep dreaming at this point, and trying to get all the ideas out that you can possibly have. So there's some ways that you can get inspired. I know for me, I love going to the grocery store. I live in a rural area, and we have seen that many of you live on farms in rural areas. So you may be in a similar situation that I am, where the grocery store that I have does not have nearly the number of products that a metropolitan area grocery store would have. So it's a special treat for me to go to, even a Kroger or a Giant Eagle or something like that, because there are just so many different products to look at. Or maybe it could be an extra treat and go someplace like Jungle Gems in Cincinnati that has some really incredible products from all over the country and all over the world, really. Those are ways that you can definitely get inspired. You could also go to farmers markets and look at what other people are making. Cookbooks are a great place, old and new cookbooks. Of course, online is always an option to look for different recipes and ways to get inspired. But I think if you're just living intentionally, where you're thinking about, wherever you are, you're just taking it in and thinking about what the possibilities may be of a product that you could make, that's going to give you a lot of ideas. Okay, so you may eventually find out that it's simply not economical for some of these ideas, but like I said, this is the dreaming state. So the ways, finding something novel or ways to get inspired are where we live in this first step. Then we go into recipe development. So this is really what the heart of the development is. If you've already got a recipe, then we're probably going to focus more on the scale up kind of time. But if you're working to meet a need and you're really trying to develop a recipe, then this is a very crucial step for you. Oh, that just went way too far. Okay, so here's some things to consider in the recipe development. Make sure that you're taking very good notes of everything that you're doing. Even, like I said, even if you have that tried and true recipe, make sure that you're keeping track of even what brand of ingredients you're using. We may not think about it, but even flour or sugar or baking soda or baking powder can have slight variabilities. So depending on what the brand is, it's a good idea to keep track of that, because what would happen if you're used to using a certain brand and you go to the grocery store, and because you're going to be scaling up and making so much of this product now, maybe there's a shortage. There's not enough of that. And so you need to use another brand. It would be a good idea up front to know what happens when you use X brand of flour instead of Y brand of flour. Make sure that you're using exact amounts. And I would really encourage you to invest in kitchen scales and weigh what your ingredients are. At this, at a small scale, using cups and using tablespoons and teaspoons, that's what we're used to on a kitchen scale. But if we're going to be making bigger batches, weight is really more reliable than what volume is. And if you think about it, like, an egg is not the same as another egg. Even if it is a large egg, there could be a variation. And if you're breaking lots and lots of eggs to add to a recipe, well, if we had just slightly smaller or slightly larger, that could make a difference in what the texture and the quality of our final product is. Pay attention to temperatures, pay attention to times, and definitely make sure if you're using perishable ingredients that you're not letting those sit out on your counter for hours at a time. You're using them and then putting them back in the refrigerator if you haven't used them completely. Make sure you're also keeping track of what kind of equipment that you've used as well. So these are all different variables that can affect what our final product is. The more consistent we are with those, but also knowing what kind of alternates there are can be really helpful for us. Then we enter into the testing phase. So we've got our product. Now we want to start looking at, one thing would be shelf life. How long will this product last? Now, of course, our hope is that people will buy it immediately and they will eat it right away. But we know that we're not always like that, right? So if it's a packaged good, we'll put it into our cupboard. We'll lay it on our counter for a while. So it's a good idea for us to know, how long does my product really last from a quality standpoint? So the taste and the texture. if I taste this immediately after I make it, okay, I can jot down some notes. This is the way that I notice the texture is. This is the way I notice what the taste is. It would be a great idea then to try that product in another few days, and then another few days, and then kind of figure out like, oh, after about 2 weeks, maybe this texture, I've got granola bars in the picture here, maybe they're getting pretty hard at this point. Now, that could be an opportunity for you to tweak something in your recipe, or it could just be note to self, I'm going to make sure that I make these immediately before I sell them. But if you're making great big batches, is that really going to work for you? Like, are you going to be able to make everything the day before the farmer's market? Or are you going to want to be able to make something all week long? So those are just some different considerations. Color is another thing to think about. Color can change over time, and we eat with our eyes. So it's a good idea to have some products that you've got set aside in whatever package you're using and see, is light making the color change over time? Is that a big deal, or does it still look appetizing? Just some things to consider, that things that could change in your product over time. And then we've got the consistency standpoint. So is your product the same every time you make it? Now, there's going to be definite leeway here for someone who's making something in their home kitchen, right? People are not going to expect us to be the same as a General Mills or another big Kellogg's company. They're not going to expect it to be exactly the same, but they do expect it. If it tasted great the first time, they're going to expect it to taste great the next time that they buy it. So make sure that you are reliable with what your quality is. And I think about sometimes with like homemade kind of crafty items or garments and things, like you'll see a little tag that says this was handmade, and so therefore there is variability from batch to batch, or so you could always have some kind of a disclaimer like that, depending on what kind of product you're making, if you're noticing that there's some kind of a consistency difference that way. Taste tests are another thing that come up. Taste tests, it's kind of up to you whether this is something that will be helpful or not. One of the things that I think is most helpful when it comes to taste tests is knowing what your goal is. So if it's just, are people going to like this or not? Well, yeah, you can ask friends, family, whoever, if they like it. But maybe it's back to, I'm trying to decide if I use brand X of flour compared to brand Y, I'm almost thinking that there's kind of a flavor difference, but I'm not sure. Like, would the normal person who eats this know that this has a flavor difference? And so you can make a batch of each and then ask people to try one of each of those. And if there's not much of a difference, hey, I'm good to go if I need to use either one of these, or I could maybe save money if I use one of these over the other. The other could be that I know there's a difference in it. Like, I've got strawberry jam, or I'm going to do a strawberry raspberry jam. I kind of want to know which people are going to like better because I've only got so many strawberries. So you could do a comparison and then ask people which ones they liked better. Going against competitors is probably not going to be the stage that we're at when we're talking about making things from our home kitchen. Then we've got scale up. So when we're thinking about scaling up, in its true sense, this would be, we're past the point of being in our home kitchen and we're ready to move on to some other kind of location and make a great big batch to sell retail. But on a smaller scale of scaling up, it's kind of thinking, I'm used to making a couple dozen cookies. Now I'm going to be thinking of making 20, 25 dozen cookies. Have you thought about what that process is like? What all do I have to take into consideration? Where am I going to store all of these? We talked last month, Nicole, as she was going through food safety, talked through how do you manage that in your home as far as keeping space or time to keep your family away from the kitchen as you're making these things. So when you're in that stage of, I'm going to make this happen, I know I need X amount, sit down and pencil out how much time it's really going to take, how many ingredients you really are going to need to have. Do I have all the packaging? Do I have enough places to let things cool? Just really think through what that process is like for you. And then we've got the launch. So that's the part that we're all dreaming about, is being able to actually sell our products, whether that is from a farmer's market, whether that is in a retail location. Peggy will talk more about what those kind of options are for us, depending on what we're making. But even though the business and the marketing is going to be really important at that point, don't forget about the food. And so continue to gather comments and information from folks, because they'll let you know about the taste, they'll let you know about the texture, they'll let you know if they're having any kind of issues. And then if you need to do any kind of adjustments, either to the way your practice is, or you can just keep doing what you're doing to make a great quality product. And the last thing that I will share with you, this is a comic from years and years ago that I found from a product development company that helps other companies with their products. If you've ever, and maybe your day job is that you work someplace where there are a lot of other people who have a lot of other jobs and you all work together, right? The good thing is that you are in charge of all of these things when it comes to starting your small food business. So you're not going to have to rely on lots of other people interpreting the product a lot of different ways. I think some of these are quite comical. I will point out, as I put my reading glasses on, how the product was documented. Again, I would encourage you to make sure that you're keeping good records of everything that you're doing, because it's only going to help you in your journey. And I wish you the best as you continue to develop your products. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Peggy at this point so that she can share more about cottage food law.
Thank you so much, Emily. I think in my secret life, I would have been a food scientist like you. I love this information and it's so useful. And it makes me think about just improving my products that I'm creating for my family. So thank you so much. And just a reminder to everyone, if you do have a question of any of us, you can ask that in the Q&A box, and we will try to answer that either through that mechanism or we'll answer it live. We have our other specialists behind the scenes watching for any questions, so please do feel free to ask questions as we move through the webinar. All right, so we're going to change course a little bit and look at the issue of regulatory compliance, or sometimes, as it may be, those times when there is not a regulation that you need to worry about. So our next two topics are going to focus on Ohio's cottage food law and Ohio's home bakery law, and explain to you what the requirements are for the types of foods that you may be wanting to produce in your food business. So this is the regulatory oversight of those home produced foods. And we need to understand, where does our food fall and what are the laws and regulations that apply to that food? Usually when we're thinking of home produced foods, we tend to think of items as you see here, those baked goods, cookies, cakes, croissants, muffins, breads. But home produced foods cover many other areas as well. And we'll see that as we work through the cottage foods and home bakery law. And then also as we work into those other types of items, such as canned foods, which Nicole will cover after this. So looking at the first two laws, the cottage food law and the home bakery law, we are talking about those food products that you would produce in your home. And actually, Ohio law contains a definition of a home. So if you're going to fall under either of these laws, the first requirement is that you are producing that product in a home. And so what is a home legally, according to these laws? Well, it's the primary residence that is occupied by that residence owner. And in that home kitchen there can only be one single or a double unit, a stove or oven that's used for cooking. And that stove or oven is designed only for common residential usage and not for commercial use. And likewise, it's just used in an ordinary kitchen. So what we're looking for is that situation where you live in the home and have your home kitchen from which you want to produce these products to make and sell. If you're in a different kind of situation than those that you see here under this definition of home, then these are not the laws that will apply to your food product. And I'll talk about that a little bit more as we progress through the laws. But the very first requirement is it needs to just be an ordinary home and home kitchen situation in order to fall under these two laws. So the difference between the two laws is going back to our first webinar where we discussed food safety and food risk and foodborne illness and those issues that come with producing food products. Because as we look at the cottage food law and compare it to the home bakery law, the distinction is that foods that fall under the cottage food law have a lower risk. They're identified as not or non-potentially hazardous, whereas foods that fall under our home bakery law have a higher risk of being hazardous, and those are identified as potentially hazardous. In the handling and production of those foods, because of those different risks, there are different requirements. And so we have less requirements under the cottage food law, a little bit higher requirements under the home bakery law. And that's why under that cottage food law, a license isn't required in order to make and sell that cottage food. There are some other legal requirements that I'll tell you about, but there is not that licensing oversight that's necessary in a cottage food situation because of that lower risk. When we're looking at items that fall under the home bakery law, we do need to register that home bakery, have that additional oversight and that additional assurance that the food handling practices will reduce that risk of some type of a foodborne illness or food safety issue. So under home bakery law, there is a license or registration requirement. So it's important then, as you think about what you want to sell, where does your item fall? Is it a cottage food? Is it a home bakery food? Or is it not under either of these laws, meaning that you'll have to look to some other laws, some other licensing or regulatory issues that might arise with your specific food product? So how do we know what falls where? Well, let's take a look first at the cottage food law and identify those foods that fall under this law that is the lesser regulated of the two categories. If you are creating one of these food products, then you would fall under this law and you do not need that license. So which foods are cottage foods that fall under that law? First, it's important to know that the cottage food law starts out by saying pretty clearly that you can't produce these types of higher risk foods under the cottage food law. So a cottage food operation cannot make acidified foods, low acid canned foods, and potentially hazardous foods. So again, we're looking for those lower risk foods. The law then turns over that authority to determine which foods are those lower risk cottage foods to our Ohio Department of Agriculture. And you can find resources there. I show you on the right, the cottage food page that's on ODA's website. And you can see also that there's a regulation that ODA has established through its rulemaking powers that contains the cottage foods list and those products that it has deemed to be cottage foods that a homemaker can make and sell from home under this law. So here's the list. It looks rather large when we see it on the screen in this way, but these are those products that fall under that cottage foods list in Ohio. And you can see that there's quite a variety. It's not just cookies and muffins. We go from certain types of jams and jellies, fruit chutneys, and fruit butters. But note that we're not talking about freezer or sugar-free varieties of those products. We have candy on the list, but not if there's fresh fruit involved that's dipped or covered or incorporated with candy. We have granola bars, and granola bars that are dipped in candy. And you can have fruit in those products as long as it's commercially dried fruit. We have unfilled baked donuts, waffle cones, and waffle cones that are dipped in candy. Our pizzelles that we're famous for here in Ohio. Uh, and look how we're expanding now into other types of foods, dry cereal and nut snack mixes. Even if they're seasoned, that's okay. We have different types of popped popcorn, including flavored kettle, popcorn balls, caramel corn. And then we move into roasted coffee. That can be either whole beans or ground, and it can be flavored. We have dry baking mixes like baking and cookie mixes, dry herbs, dry herb blends, dry soup mixes, and those can contain some commercially dried products like vegetables and beans and grains, dry seasoning blends, dry tea blends. And then we also have some maple sugar and flavored honey products, as long as those are coming from beekeepers and maple syrup producers who are producing at least 75% of that honey or sap for the maple syrup. And then we have the last item that I've noted in bold there, non-potentially hazardous bakery products. So under that category, we're going to have quite a few other products that come in. And this is the part where ODA discretion is very important, because ODA has that authority to determine which of the bakery products that we might want to produce are non-potentially hazardous and which are potentially hazardous. So potentially hazardous, as I mentioned, means that there are some food handling practices necessary to reduce that higher food safety risk that the food creates. And so which ones are which? ODA has some good guidance available that helps us delineate between those different types of baked goods. And if a baked good, according to ODA, is non-potentially hazardous, that means you can create that baked good under the cottage food law. If it's potentially hazardous, then it's going to fall under the home bakery law. So let's look specifically at those baked goods that fall into these two categories. You see the chart that I've provided there on the right. We have, as we would expect, cookies, brownies, cake. Those are lower risk, non-potentially hazardous foods. Breads, certain types of pies, you can see there fruit pies fall under non-potentially hazardous, as do cobblers. And then the law itself mentions several baked goods that are cottage foods, and those would be granola bars, unfilled baked donuts, waffle cones, and pizzelles. And those were over on the other list that you saw. But the big question is, what other kinds of baked goods are not cottage foods and are potentially hazardous? And we have some ODA guidance on those types of foods. And you can see that those are foods that require some special care. Usually that would be that there's a temperature requirement, a refrigeration requirement, some special care to ensure that that food remains safe or doesn't spoil. So we have cheesecakes, cream pies, pumpkin pies, fry pies, filled donuts, waffles, Belgian waffles, raw doughs, egg noodles, cream cheese frosting, and pepperoni rolls all come out through ODA guidance as those potentially hazardous home baked goods that are going to put us over into the home bakery category. So we have quite a few items that we covered, but we also have a list of some that don't fall under the categories we've mentioned so far. So which foods are not cottage foods? You'll see the guidance again provided by ODA that tells us the list that we just reviewed on the left-hand side, allowed under the cottage food law. On the right-hand side, not allowed. So they're not cottage foods. They might be home bakery items, and so we would go to the home bakery law for them, or they just may fall under a different type of law. So if it's not on this cottage food list on the right, it's not a home bakery food that ODA has noted as non-potentially hazardous, then you can't produce it under the cottage food law, and you'll need to look to another law. If you're not sure, if you have something in your mind, and Emily and Nicole and I hear those products that you're all coming up with all the time, and we'll get those questions. Well, what would this be? Ask us or ask ODA, and we can help clarify where that falls on these different types of lists and under which law you would be subject. So that list is available on ODA's website. I give you the link there if you want to go back to that in the future. Okay, so when we are looking at that cottage food list, as I said, there's no license required for those products, but what laws do apply to those types of operations that want to make and sell cottage foods? Well, there are packaging and labeling laws that we need to understand and comply with. We also have some provisions that restrict the sale of cottage food products. And there is still, even though it's not a licensed food product, there is still ODA sampling authority that can apply to cottage food. So I'm going to explain those different provisions for you. First, the packaging and labeling. And the one restriction that we have in the cottage food law is that you cannot pack a cottage food product in reduced oxygen packaging. That's the only packaging provision that we need to be aware of for our cottage foods. And Emily and Nicole would be better versed at explaining why that poses a risk to that food to put it in that reduced oxygen packaging. But the restriction is there in the law that is not permitted. We're going to discuss the labeling provisions for cottage food toward the end of this section, and we'll address both cottage foods and home bakery items at the same time and review the labeling requirements for them both together. So as far as where you can sell your cottage food products, who can buy them and where can you sell them? Well, you can sell them directly to consumers. You can sell them to retail food establishments, a food service operation, those types of institutions that have another type of food license can buy your cottage foods, can offer them for sale, or can incorporate them into products and food that they're making and selling. But be aware, even if you're selling it to those types of establishments, you still have to properly label your cottage food. Doesn't mean that you can sell them wholesale without any of those other legal requirements in place. As far as where you can sell them, you're limited to the state of Ohio. You can only sell Ohio cottage foods within the state of Ohio. They can't be sold outside of our state. And then another law to be aware of is the sampling law that allows ODA to go into a cottage food operation or a home bakery or another type of licensed facility and inspect a food product if there's a concern that the food is adulterated or misbranded. So this authority, as I said, is implemented by the Ohio Department of Agriculture, and they can do that through random sampling of foods that are just out there in the marketplace, or it might be that someone files a complaint or alerts them to a product a food product that there's a concern about, and there is a complaint procedure available on ODA's website. But in either instance, they'll inspect that food and determine whether it is adulterated or misbranded. We don't see a lot of these issues with cottage foods, but if there is an issue, that's something that you might be hearing from ODA, and they would help you determine how to remedy that problem. So moving on then to the home bakery law and looking at what the requirements are for those home bakery goods that we reviewed earlier, we need to look at the law as kind of a licensing process, even though it uses the word registration, home bakery registration. It says you must register, but it's basically a licensing process that's required for those home-based, potentially hazardous baked goods. And we reviewed that list that you see there on the right, foods that we definitely know, those baked goods that fall under that potentially hazardous category. This law is administered by ODA, and that is their determination of those foods that will require that bakery registration or license. So remember, we're looking at those foods that are prepared in a home. If you're a bakery, that is a home, you're preparing it in a commercial kitchen somewhere, or your home isn't occupied by you as the baker, or you're doing it in someone else's residence. Any of those kinds of non-home situations, you can't use the home bakery registration for your oversight. You'll have to go into a different law in those situations if you're not actually making that baked good in a home kitchen. Whoops, excuse me. So the process for registering your home bakery is first, you can go online and obtain this form that you see here on the left. That's a request for inspection. And that's because your home, your kitchen will need to be inspected by ODA in order to receive that registration or license. It's a very simple process. It's available online. You can email it to them, and then they will coordinate a time for your inspection. And you can see that the information that it requires is pretty simple: your name and address, and where you live, how to contact you. And then they want to know what type of food are you producing. So pretty simple, no fee due until the inspection and the registration is granted, and that would be a $10 fee. And then every year you would be required to renew that registration by September 30th. So what's involved in that inspection? Well, they'll be looking at your home, your home kitchen, and looking for a safe environment to produce your home bakery item. And you can see here the guidance that ODA provides on what they will be examining the home for. We need clean and easily cleanable walls and ceilings and floors, and they need to be in good repair. We can't have carpet in the kitchen, and we can't have any pets or pests in the home. I get a lot of questions about pets. What about my son has a turtle in his bedroom. We can't have any pets or pests in the home if we're going to have a home bakery there. Kitchen and equipment and utensils, have to be clean and sanitary. And then there's a thermometer requirement. We need a mechanical refrigerator that has a thermometer that's capable of measuring, and that refrigerator capable of maintaining a 45-degree temperature. And then if you're on a private water well at your home, then you're going to need a negative bacteria test result, and that had to have occurred within the last year, and you'll have to continue to test that annually. And then also they'll want to examine your label to determine that it meets legal requirements. And as I said, we'll discuss the labels. As far as where you can sell your home bakery goods, there is not a restriction as there is with the cottage food law. You can sell them outside of the state of Ohio, but Ohio's license doesn't apply in those states. You'll need to obtain a license or determine the laws in those other states and make sure that you're complying with those laws as well. So Ohio doesn't restrict you from selling your home bakery goods in another state. All right, so that covers the main requirements around what you have to do and how to do it and what those regulations are. But the final piece is looking at the food label. And so we need to understand what those food label requirements are for the two different products. And Emily is going to join us now to cover this section. Emily, are you there?
I am. I will tell you, I have been frantically typing behind the scenes. We've had some really great questions that have come through. So we may end
Good.
up being able to talk about some of those as we finish up this evening. Yes, food label requirements. As we look at what needs to go onto the label, we want to note that Ohio has adopted federal laws that apply to nutritional claims and also to the major food allergens. But there are some separate and special laws that apply just to cottage food and home bakery food items. And they're fairly simplistic. There shouldn't be any big surprises here, but this information all is required to be on a label. So your principal display panel, kind of the fancy word for the main part of a label. If you think about a box of something at the grocery store, the principal display panel kind of can show up in some different places. If you have a small product and you are thinking about making a label, like on your inkjet printer, that's going to be your principal display, right? So it's where you're going to be putting the information on your product. So the statement of identity is really what is actually in your product. So if you have some fanciful name, you also need to explain to the consumer what it really is as well, like unicorn droppings or whatever. Okay, that who knows what that is? You've got to make sure that we know this is a type of flavored popcorn. Statement of responsibility. This is where you kind of have to put yourself out there because there needs to be traceability in case anything ever would happen with your product, that you can be contacted. So this includes name, street address, city, state, zip code. Now, if you're not crazy about putting your name actually on that product, we talked last month about having a business. So you could have a business name in that case, but that is information that is required. You could also put a website on. You could put find me on Facebook and put up wherever you are on Facebook, but the required information is stated there for the statement of responsibility. You also need to include include the net weight, and it uses a couple of different measurements. So you'll want to put the ounces as well as the grams for that. And that is always going to be found kind of near the bottom of the product. And if you kind of think about what normal food products look like, that's where people look. You're not usually looking up at the top to know how much of something is within the package. And then there's the ingredient list. So in this case, we're listing all of the ingredients, anything that is in that food package. And it starts with whatever you have the most of, and then you go down to the least amount. The thing that gets a little bit tricky is when you're using an ingredient that also has its own ingredient list. So in that case, you need to put, like for instance, if it's chocolate chips, you would need to put in parentheses, these are all the ingredients that are within chocolate chips. One of the reasons that that is helpful is because of the next point, which is major food allergens. So somewhere on that package, whether it's in the ingredient statement, or if you do a separate call out, which is very helpful for folks, you need to list if there are any of the 9 major food allergens. 9 might sound surprising to some folks that are kind of up on this. It used to be the big 8, but we've introduced one more as of January 1st of this year. Sesame has been added to the list. So those are all listed there. You can either have it, like I said, in the statement, as long as it clearly says, it's not like if you had butter, but you hadn't included milk somehow, you would need to specify milk so that we can't make any assumptions that people would know that butter is related to milk. So it does help to have that contains, and then whatever the allergen is just specified out can be very helpful for folks. If you do have any inkling of wanting to make a nutrient content or health claim, like this is low fat, or saying something like this may reduce heart disease, then you've got to be able to prove that. You've got to have a laboratory analysis of exactly what is in your product. There's a lot of rules that are around that, but just know we can't just put whatever we want on a label, especially when it relates to any kind of a health claim or a nutrient content claim. When we look at specifically cottage food and home bakery foods, for cottage foods, the one other thing that is required is this statement that says this product is home produced. The reason that this is on there, I used to think long ago, like it's kind of almost a marketing thing, right? Like to say, this is fantastic. It's this product that is produced in a home, like how sweet and wonderful. But really, it's kind of a warning to people to let them know that this has been made in a home. We already know without inspection, no one's been in that home to know what's going on or what the conditions might be. And I don't say that to scare, but that's really why it's on there. Especially if someone does have severe allergies of some type, this isn't made in a facility that is cleaned and sanitized the same way that a food manufacturing plant would be, right? It's a normal kitchen. And so maybe the youngest of the house got up that morning and made a peanut butter sandwich and didn't quite clean up everything off of the kitchen counter. That's why this statement is there, is just to let folks know this was made in somebody's house. So it's up to you whether you decide that you want to purchase it and consume this product. Along with that, then for the home bakery food, if it requires refrigeration, which is something that you will have established with ODA when you end up getting your license, then it needs to have a declaration, something like keep refrigerated or requires refrigeration. And then if it's something where we talked a little bit about shelf life up front, where you think this is not going to last 30 days, then it's a good idea to give people an idea, right? There's a lot of debate out there about putting any type of a shelf life date on products, because we certainly don't want food waste. But at the same time, it's helpful for the consumer to know, like, oh, I shouldn't let this sit in my cupboard for a month before I eat it. We really should eat this in the next week or two if we want to enjoy it and for it to have good quality. So here is an example of a cottage food label. Just looking at all the different pieces and parts. So we've got our statement of where it's being made. We've got our company there. This has a website listed. Again, that's not required, but it's something that is allowed to go on the label. There's our declaration. This product is home produced. We've got our little brand on there, very clearly identifies what is in here. You're also allowed to have images. I'll say, it's always very helpful if your image matches your product somehow. I will just throw out that there is a local producer whose name of their business has something to do with berries, but they make a product that's chocolate fudge. And so on their package of chocolate fudge, they had berries on top of it. Well, if you just kind of glance at it, your first thought is maybe this is like a raspberry fudge or some type of a mixed berry fudge, when berries really have nothing to do with it. So, think about that with your label to make sure that you're not misleading your consumer in any way, even if it's unintentional. In that case, they weren't intentionally doing that. It had to do with their name, but it really had nothing to do with what the actual product was that was in the package. Then we've got our ingredient statement that's there, again, starting with what you've got the most of down to the least. And you'll see as our example for that, peanut butter, we've got that parentheses because this is all the ingredients of the peanut butter. So the actual ingredients of the fudge are peanut butter, and then you skip all the way down to sugar, milk, and vanilla. Almost everything is really the ingredients for the peanut butter, but that needs to be spelled out. And then in this case, we've got an extra contains just to let people know for sure, even though peanut is specified in the ingredient list, soy shows up there as well, and so does milk. But that just helps those that do have allergies just to be able to locate that quickly. And then with our home bakery label, very similar to what we saw on the last. You'll see in this case, there's really the custard pie is not really the star of this label, right? But that's fine. You can make the label look however you want. This has all the components. It's maybe not as fancy or maybe doesn't have quite the appeal maybe that the other label might have, but it has all the components on it. And in this case, you'll see the difference is that it has that keep refrigerated on it because it is a custard pie, and then it does have a best buy. This is not expires. We're not going to use that kind of a term, but best buy, which just suggests that if you want the best quality, this is a date that you should try to aim for. Okay, so we've thrown a lot at you as far as cottage foods and home bakery, but many of you listed that you've got some other ideas of things that you want to make. So I will just say, my grandpa used to say there is more than one way to skin a cat, which I don't know really what that has to do with anything. I would probably rather say that where there's a will, there's a way. So if you are interested in making some of these other products, but you're thinking, oh, I can't do this in my home, that is what Nicole is going to share with us now.
And I'm going to start by going back to Peggy's comment about reduced oxygen packaging. It's actually a really nice segue into the canned foods conversation. So in regards to not being able, and hopefully I've got this right, Peggy, not being able to use reduced oxygen packaging for cottage foods, the reason for that, I would assume, is because there are some bacteria that grow well in reduced oxygen environments. And that is no different than canning as well, and some of the other processing methods that we would use. And before I dive right in, especially since I know some of you are interested in making these types of products, I hope that you know that I'm someone who has taken the Better Process Control School. I've taken food processing classes. I'm sure some of us on here have. And I've worked with acidified foods and other types of canned foods for a long time now. And I still have to get clarification and ask questions very regularly. So please know if your mind's going in a million directions, and as I deliver this content about acid and acidified and low acid canned foods, if it all seems very confusing, please know that the regulatory space for food, it is very confusing. It's why I have a job. But in no way, shape, or form do we expect you to just know these things or to not ask questions. There is a lot of confusion around all the different terms that we use. And there's also a lot of different ways to interpret the rules and guidelines and sometimes even laws that we have to abide by in the food space. So I just want to throw that out there. So I want to reiterate that home canned foods are not cottage foods. And I feel like we all make these big, bold statements and then say, and then there's an exception, and then there's an exception. And again, that's just kind of how the regulatory world works. So in this case, yes, home canned foods are not cottage foods in general, but there is the exception of the jams, the jellies, and the fruit butters that are cottage foods. But then again, there's a further exception where freezer jams and sugar-free jams, jellies, and fruit butters also are not cottage foods. And something that I want to point out before I go any further is that we tend to use the word can as both a verb and a noun. So it can kind of get a little bit confusing. I don't know if you've ever thought of that before, but even in the way that we, what might come to mind in terms of a container, there's a lot of different words that we use interchangeably, or a lot of different things that we use interchangeably for that word of can. So whether it's a tin can, whether it's a glass bottle, it could be a ball jar. Again, it depends on who you talk to. Oftentimes we'll just say can. Pun intended here, you can for your own personal use. And I just wanted to differentiate home canning versus canning for with the intention of selling. And extension, as well as many other sources, have just numerous resources in terms of helping with home food preservation, even in addition to canning. But I just want to make sure folks know that if you are canning for your own personal use, what we're about to talk about doesn't apply to that. You still want to take canning, home canning, very seriously. And that's why there are so many recommendations surrounding that. But again, home canning for your own personal use is going to be very different than canning with the intention of selling those canned foods. And if you do have any questions about home canning, please know that you can always reach out to Extension. We have an upcoming webinar series. And really the one thing that I want to say is that when you're home canning, you need to make sure that you're using trusted resources. And this all goes back to the fact that if you can correctly and process whatever item you're processing correctly, canned foods are some of the safest types of foods. However, on the flip side, if you're not processing canned foods correctly, they can be some of the most dangerous food items. And that's why we take this so very seriously. And there are so many restrictions for the sale of canned foods. Who oversees canned foods? Both the licensing and the inspection is taken care of by ODA, and specifically the Division of Food Safety. And this is regardless of where that product is being sold. So always feel free to reach out to them if you have any questions, in addition to the folks who are on the webinar. So again, why are there so many regulations that are required from food producers in regards to canned foods? And it really goes back to that aspect of risk that we talked about on that first webinar, that every single food item, and I'm not just talking about the food that's in its original form, also how we process foods as well, changes the dynamic of a food product completely. And there's different levels of risks associated with these different types of foods. And in particular, canned foods pose a risk for bacteria. That bacteria specifically is called Clostridium botulinum, or CBOT for short. And under the right conditions, it can produce a lethal toxin, and specifically a neurotoxin. So again, this isn't to scare anyone. This is just to, again, go back to the idea that we have these regulations in place because of the risk that is presented. And I like to show this graphic. If it looks complicated, that's a good thing. That's my point. And this is to show that, again, there's so many characteristics that go into play in terms of what we would call the processing parameters that need to take place, that need to be applied to whatever food product you're making in that acidified and low acid canned food space. So at the bottom, you can see that the pH of foods, and this is very much aligned with that first webinar, that it varies drastically, whether you're going to be working with fruits, meats, etc. That pH it varies drastically. And dependent on that pH is, again, going to be, it depends on what else we're going to have to do to that food product to make it safe. So you can see where if you're using a high acid food, and again, I know that this can be a little bit confusing. So high acid means low pH. Then you may only need mild heat because you have a lot of acid present. And on the flip side, when we get to higher pHs, so we call those low acid foods, you're going to need extensive heat in order to destroy what we would call those spores that might be present. And spores is kind of an interesting concept where these are almost like dormant seeds. And really, they're nothing to be afraid of. In general, we actually consume spores on a regular basis. But, and this is pertinent to adults specifically, but when we ingest spores, because of the acid that's in our stomach, they don't germinate. So they just pass through our body. But what ends up happening is if there's spores in a food product, and then they're presented with the right conditions, like we mentioned with Peggy's example with the ROP packaging, then they could potentially germinate and cause a food safety issue. One of the first steps is always going to be to determine what kind of food you are making. And again, I know that this is a little bit complicated, but feel free to ask questions where before we can provide you guidance and what you need to do in order to follow the rules and follow the steps in order to get your product to market, we first have to be confident about how your product is characterized. And so we have these three categories that I've divided based on pH foods up into. So it's either an acid food, and that means that foods have a natural pH below 4.6. And on that first webinar, we mentioned that 4.6, it really is this magic number for us in food safety, because we would generally say that that Clostridium botulinum that I just mentioned won't grow below 4.6 as a pH. And just as a reminder, that pH means acidity. And examples of that are a lot of different types of fruits. And then tomatoes are kind of a funky one where there's a lot of variability between the different varieties of tomatoes. So we just have to be careful about that. But many of them do have a pH less than 4.6. And then when it comes to acidified foods, these are foods that tend to be low acid. So in the other category that we haven't talked about yet, to which an acid has been added to it. And we're adding an acid to drop that the pH down further to make sure that, again, the pH gets low enough to where it's safe. And a lot of times these are referred to as pickled foods. And I've given some examples. These are your salsas, your pickles, a lot of different sauces will fall into this category. And then there's low acid food. And this is any food with a finished pH greater than that 4.6, but also has a water activity greater than 0.85, which again may seem very subjective and random, but that 0.85 is another sort of magical number that we use in the food safety world, where that water activity is, again, back to that first webinar, is the available moisture. An example of examples of low acid foods are carrots, beans, jalapenos, and our meat products as well. And since I got some questions on the first webinar, I want to make sure folks know too, and going back to that diagram as well, that I hope was helpful to see the complexities of what's needed to make a safe acidified or sometimes low acid food product, is that you can't just take a pH strip and put it in a container of food and say, well, this is the pH. There's so many different characteristics to take into consideration where you have to think about things like the size of chunks in whatever food product you're making, and making sure that the acid, at least in an example of an acidified food, is able to penetrate that chunk of whatever you're making. Because that acid has to be dispersed. It can't just be in the brine. We need to make sure that the whole entire product is getting under that 4.6. And even though that 4.6 is the magic number, sometimes when we're doing product testing and making recommendations, we're probably going to give you a lower pH, something like 4.2 to aim for, because we need to be able to build in that margin from a safety perspective. These are some general steps that you will have to take if you're planning to make these types of foods. So for, again, just that acid, that naturally acidic food, you first have to determine, this is the most important part for this one, you have to determine what the actual pH is. Okay? And a lot of times I think what ODA is looking for is not just that you've taken the pH, but that you've actually gotten the product tested or have some sort of documentation that this is actually legitimate, that pH reading. And again, just a reminder, it's not just one pH reading. If we were doing this in a university testing lab, we would take the pH of the brine. We would also take the chunks of the foods, if there are any, and put it into a blender with some water, and also take the pH of the chunks as well. And for an acidified canned food, again, they're food products where the finished pH after adding an acid drops below 4.6. I have on here that you must attend the Better Process Control School, and we're going to talk a little bit about what that entails. But really, it means that someone who is actually involved in the processing will have to take the Better Process Control School. Whether you, as the individual who is the individual who's created this recipe, has to take the Better Process Control School, is going to be dependent on a few different things. You're also going to have your product evaluated by something that we call a process authority, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about who and what those are. You will have to register with the FDA as a cannery and file your process before you call ODA for an inspection. And even though I have these kind of laid out as you have to go through all these before you call ODA for an inspection, we want to make sure that you feel comfortable reaching out to ODA, or even us to reach out to ODA if we can't answer a question at any step in the process. We don't want you to get to the very end and still have questions. We want to make sure that if you do something like go take the Better Process Control School, you know that you're supposed to be there. So what is a process authority? And this term is really vague. It's not a very straightforward thing. But the way that it's defined is that it's an individual who has expert knowledge in these processing requirements for canned foods. And knowledge can be obtained by education or experience, or both. And I think that this is where the vagueness comes in. That last sentence, an expert implies experience, knowledge, and achievement, as well as recognition as an authority on a subject, usually by one's peers. So FDA doesn't officially regulate training to be a process authority. And I believe that's to allow flexibility for who these individuals can be. There is some flexibility there. But if you decide to call yourself a process authority and you start writing these letters, and these letters will tell someone who wants to make a canned food how they have to make it in order for it to be safe, you have to be recognized by the regulatory agencies in your state. So you would want to have a good relationship with them. So the big question is, does Ohio State have a process authority? And the answer to that is no, which I think is very unhelpful for those of us who are trying to point you in the right direction to ask all these good questions about making these types of foods. But if you are someone on this call or watching the webinar later and you do want to make a canned food, please don't think that because Ohio State doesn't have a process authority, it is not a barrier in any way, shape, or form for you to continue to make that food product. So you are allowed to go to other process authorities in other states for assistance. And I've provided some recommendations of individuals that I know. And there are process authorities who are not explicitly affiliated with land-grant universities. There can be private process authorities, but to my knowledge, I'm not familiar with anyone that would be recommended from a private company here in Ohio that at least takes precedence to the ones that I would recommend from the university landscape. And one of the reasons I say that is because these folks, Nick Fragedakis at NC State and Joelle Eifert at Virginia Tech, they've been doing this for several years, and I feel very confident in their ability to help clientele. And the fact that they're tied to a land-grant university, the prices associated with food product testing, I believe, are pretty competitive in terms of them being really low cost for clientele. So again, a process authority is someone who's an expert in processing, and specifically low acid canned foods or acidified foods. They have to be recognized in some way, shape, or form. Someone from the general public just can't say, hey, I'm a process authority, I'm going to do this type of work. It is very serious because they're making recommendations based on safety. And then these individuals could be associated with a private company or a public institution. And I wanted to show you just an example of how you can get in touch with a process authority. This is Virginia Tech's webpage, and both NC State and Virginia Tech have these testing labs where they help small food producers. And Virginia Tech, they just rebranded, and there's, I'm showing you this because people have all different kinds of names for what their testing lab is or does. And this one for Virginia Tech is the Food Producer Technical Assistance Network. And you might be saying, Nicole, why are you sending me all the way to the East Coast? But it's because we used to send individuals to Kentucky, and I believe we no longer do that, but there just are not a lot of process authorities that are around. Maybe we can get one at Ohio State. That's certainly a need. But these are individuals that I trust and have the capacity to take on out-of-state clientele if you need them. And here's an example of some of the services that Virginia Tech offers. Again, you don't have to go to Virginia Tech. You don't have to go to NC State. These are just personal recommendations because I know that they do this. And you can see some of the prices associated with those services. And they do a lot of different things. You could either request a pH analysis only. Depending on your food product, you might want a water activity analysis. You might even say, I just have no idea what type of food product I have, and they will help you determine what your food product is, what it is characterized as. And this can be even for folks that don't do canned foods. They also will help create a nutrition facts panel or a nutrition label for you. And I would say that the turnaround time is normally about I would say 6 to 8 weeks, but you do have to keep an eye on the university holiday schedule as well. And I get a lot of questions about, okay, I've sent off this product for testing for this process authority letter that's going to be provided that I'm going to then give to ODA or have on file. What happens if I want to make, in this case, let's say you're making a barbecue sauce and you're going to make a mild version and a spicy version. You know, do you have to send in your product twice? And I would say that the short answer is yes, that anytime you change any ingredient in a formulation, in a recipe, that changes the entire dynamic of the food product, especially when it comes to acidified and low acid canned food products. But we know that this is very common, that someone will have a hot sauce with different flavor profiles, varying levels of heat, or there might be a product that you make that has the same base with multiple flavors. And so there is ways where you have reduced fees associated with those types of products with just, a lot of times it's just one ingredient change. For the Better Process Control School, this is the course that someone who is processing that canned food product has to take. These are the different topics that are associated with it. So the different types of FDA regulations associated with canned foods, the micro aspect of thermally processed foods, different types of equipment for different processing systems. Again, this is going to be very dependent on what food you're making. And Ohio State does offer the Better Process Control School In my personal opinion, it is a little bit of a hefty fee. I've confirmed with ODA that you don't have to take it through an Ohio, from anyone in Ohio that provides the Better Process Control School. I think it's helpful if you do, because those individuals will know the state and any state and local regulations or recommendations that they can make better than other entities. However, if you want to take, let's say, an online course that's cheaper through a reputable source, you can still do that. So technically, the processor is the individual who has to take the Better Process Control School. And wanted to give you the exact definition, the processor includes any person engaged in the actual production of those foods. And so there's going to be someone who has to take the Better Process Control School, who is responsible for processing on behalf of an entity. And now if you use a shared space, there may be variation in this. So if you go to an entity like SIFT or AceNet, they may require the clientele to take the Better Process Control School. And I can't tell you exactly what their requirements are, but I'm just sharing that there are differences in what that requirement would be if you're going to use a shared use space. Now, if you use a co-packer, generally you're not going to be the one that has to take that Better Process Control School. And you always can if you're interested, that there's no sort of rule that you can't go ahead and take it. We just know that some folks may not be interested in taking it unless they have to. And I'm just going to fly through these because I know we're almost out of time. I had some commentary on some other food products, and there might be some caveats to these rules and regulations as well. So if you want to make your own egg noodles in your home, they can't be produced as a cottage food. You have to have a home bakery license. And again, it might require refrigeration, as it's a potentially hazardous item if you're selling them fresh. And then there's specific rules if you want to sell at a farmer's market, then you have to have a license from your local health department. But again, there might be caveats to this. If you process egg noodles in a different way, there might be differences. So it's really important for us to go on a case-by-case basis in terms of what specific product you are making. Donuts is another funny one. There's two different options for making donuts in your home specifically. If you make unfilled baked donuts in your home, then it can be a cottage food. But if you are actually going to fill those donuts, then you're going to have a home bakery license. And then I wanted to bring up freeze-dried products very quickly. This is becoming very popular, but technically freeze-dried food products cannot be sold as a cottage food. And we see a lot of folks doing this and selling them, but technically you would need to obtain a license and operate in a manufacturing facility, to my knowledge, if you want to make freeze-dried. So they cannot be under cottage food laws.
Okay, thank you, Nicole. There's a lot to cover, and I really appreciated how you explained some of those canning issues that we see and the confusion that can revolve around those. Very helpful information. And we hope the entire webinar was helpful to you this evening, and we thank you for joining us. Remember that we have a few survey questions upon exit that we would like for you to answer. Very short, just 3 questions. But that's important to us because what we hear from you guides our work. That is very, very informative to what we do in the future. So watch for a follow-up email. We'll be sending that out here in the next day that will point you to some of our resources. We have a new cottage foods bulletin coming out that Emily and I are finishing up. We have other resources that we want to refer you to help you continue to learn more about producing these home produced foods. Thanks again. And remember, you can find all of these resources on our website, farmoffice.osu.edu or at go.osu.edu, starting a food business. All right. Thanks, everyone. And thanks to Emily back there answering all those questions. We'll see you next month. Our next webinar is on selling meat and poultry. So Garth will be joining us and we'll be covering the economics of selling those meat food products and meat processing options. And then I'll be discussing those labeling and licensing laws that go with selling meat. So we hope to see you then on March 28th for the next webinar in this series. Thanks and good night, everyone.